my question will be, first of all, I want to talk about communications. In the first meeting that we had with the airlines and the airports, we learned that the minister himself had never communicated with the airports regarding the chaos that had happened during the holiday season, and we learned that he had not spoken with the airlines directly, certainly not with Sunwing, until January the 5th, after all the passengers had returned home from being stranded abroad. So I guess my question for you is, when, Mr. Landry, did you speak personally with the minister about the situation that plagued VIA over the holiday season? On what date, please?
Maybe contextualizing our relationship with Transport Canada and the ministry. As a Crown corporation, as you can imagine, we have daily contacts with Transport Canada across a wide.
I'm aware, but my question specifically, the context we're aware of, but in terms of Mr. Algabra's communication with you directly, on what date did that occur?
So we had ongoing communications with the minister's office, and we set up a meeting with the minister post-incident to review actions, not only what happened during the events, but more importantly, the action plan to address the shortcomings, and that meeting was held on January 11th.
Okay, that's good to know. I wanted to talk briefly about well, first of all, I'll just say that seems awfully late in the day. Again, a delayed response to what was an emergent situation. Speaking of the emergency nature, I think, having listened to your testimony, the passengers were actually quite lucky that the incident wasn't worse, because it appears, what if the tree had been struck and the train had derailed? How long would it have taken emergency crews to access the site? It seems like what we're hearing is it would have been impossible for crews to get there inside of 13 hours. And so that is very, very troubling to me, that if the incident had been any worse, it already was terrible for the people on board. What would the response have been? How would it have been different had there been a breach of one of the carriages, or had there been trains actually jumped the track and that the passengers were deemed to not have been in a safe environment? It seems that we were very close to that scenario happening, and it's very troubling to me that in what is a fairly populated part of Ontario, that we're being told that the emergency response plan there could not have been anything done to assist the passengers on that train any sooner than service was offered. So can you explain that to me, how that's possible, how we could have been, as my colleague said, not that far? Yes, the terrain was difficult, but not that far from civilization, if you want to call it that, and yet so many hours before assistance apparently could have arrived at that train.
Michael?
Thank you for the question, MP Strahl. I think at the beginning of your question you mentioned that if the train had left the track, or if the train had been breached and exposed to the environment, that would have constituted an emergency. And yes, at that point, emergency protocols would have been enacted based on the passengers no longer being safe in terms of light, heat, sanitation. Emergency services had been contacted and did attend the train in the morning. I can't speak to what the emergency services timeline response would have been in a greater level of emergency, i.e. the train derailed or the passengers no longer had light and heat.
Right. Okay. You talked about, Mr. Landry, you talked about the refunds and credits being offered to rail passengers. In the air sector, when an airline has a delay or fails to get someone to their destination, they have to pay $1,000 per passenger. We've heard some difficulties in passengers getting that. Do you believe that Via Rail should be brought under a similar passenger protection regulation, where not only would you make them whole, you would offer refunds and credits and vouchers and that, which the airlines do as well, But do you believe that Via Rail should have to pay $1,000 to passengers who are impacted, such as those were impacted on Train 55 over the Christmas holidays?
Well, we'd welcome a discussion around better passenger protection for rail passengers, but I think for it to be relevant, I think it would be important to have the host railways as part of this process. As we are so dependent on the host railways to deliver our service, that I think in order for us to improve the customer experience, part of this will come through enacting rules and guidelines that would give, for example, greater priority for passenger train services so that the schedules could be met and avoid the need for penalties as the number of delays would be significantly reduced.
Thank you very much, Mr. Landry, and thank you very much, Mr. Strahl. Next, we have Ms. Koutrakis. Ms. Koutrakis, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses from Via Rail appearing before us today. It's very appreciated. I, for one, use Via Rail services very, very frequently to come from Montreal to Ottawa, weekly, I would say. And firsthand, I have to say that Via has always delivered exceptional client service. In fact, I'm sure if you ask many Canadians who use Via Rail on a regular basis, or even just, from time to time, they've experienced exceptional customer service. Past serious disruptions and situations often led to exceptional service, recovery, and positive passenger feedback. I'm sure if you look at your stats, it will concur what I'm saying. This included timely and honest communications, giving passengers complimentary food, water, beverages, blankets, etc. Why did these things not happen preemptively over the Christmas holidays?
Thank you, MP Koutrakis, and once again to the passengers that were involved and suffered through the extended delay. I apologize. I appreciate what you say. First off, thanks for your travel with us. And you're right, we do often get many commendations as a result of our great service. I think that's why we're taking it very personally that we did not live up to our expectations. Our passengers expect better of us, and we weren't able to deliver in this case. I think putting it in context, the number of trains that were delayed in most cases, we managed to properly communicate, at least much better. Even if we didn't hit the standard, we were fairly good at keeping people apprised of what was going on. We managed to get food to certain trains where we could get access to it. I think the outlier is Train 55. Given the protracted delay, given the lack of clear information that we were able to garner, there was misinformation we offered the passengers. We exacerbated the level of anxiety of those passengers on board, and that's on us for not properly and clearly communicating what we were doing and reassuring them. That's where our learning has to come from. So we're doing a deep dive and obviously overview of everything we did with all our trains, but very specifically with Train 55. What could we do differently to make it better next time?
Thank you for your response. And what we've heard through your testimony is that Via is essentially dependent on other track owners on most of its routes. These track owners also operate their own substantial businesses or services over the same tracks that essentially compete for track on or station space with Via Rail. Please quickly describe the challenges of this ownership structure and how would high-frequency rail avoid the chronic problems that arise, and would it?
Well, thank you for your question, and I think it's very relevant to have this discussion from a policy perspective. We deal in an environment where the host railways dictate the priorities of the trains, and they do provide an essential service to Canadians, moving significant amount of goods and key contributors to the supply chain. And so there's always this fine balance about who would ultimately win out. And as long as we live in this environment where there's mixed traffic and that the host dictates the priorities, we're unlikely to be able to provide the level of customer service that we would like to provide to our customers, and where we believe they should be entitled to. Which led to ultimately the development of the high-frequency rail proposal, where we segment that traffic in order for us to be able to better dispatch passenger rail trains in order to provide them the service that they're entitled to.
And I believe it was in your comments, Mr. Brankley, where you talked about a new fleet that is coming in short order. So if this new fleet was in place, how might this have affected how well you were able to respond to these events? Or would that not have had any impact in these circumstances whatsoever?
Thank you for the question, MP Koutrakis. In the circumstances in question, I don't believe a new fleet would have led to any significantly different outcome.
Okay. And we hear criticism, from my honorable colleagues about Minister Alghabra and not having, personally communicated directly with your contact. Could you please explain to our committee and for Canadians at large, would it have made any difference when the minister communicated directly himself? And did you have the support from Transport Canada and the minister's office for what you required at that very specific moment? Would it have made a difference, and if so, how?
I think it's important to remember that the events were really focused around operations and reestablishing operations. And so most of our contacts with Transport Canada were very much focused on resuming these operations. The solution was simple. The solution was to remove the derailed train in order for the infrastructure to be made available to Via Rail trains. That was clear from the moment the derailment happened. So that's where we spent most of our energies working with the Transport Canada officials and CN to focus on enabling that solution to take place. And we believe that we were at this point dealing with the proper contacts because, as I mentioned, these were very operations-centric discussions that we were having.
Thank you very much, Ms. Koutrakis, and thank you once again, Mr. Landry. Next, we have Mr. Strahl. Mr. Strahl, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand that the Liberals do get a little bit sensitive when I talk about the minister being accountable and active on this file, and they might think it's okay to wait 2+ weeks to engage with companies that experienced massive travel delays and whose passengers were severely impacted over the holidays. If that's the level of accountability and leadership that they believe the minister should have, I guess they can defend that. I'll make no apologies for saying that the minister should have been more engaged more quickly with all industry players as this crisis unfolded. I want to talk a bit about the food and beverage situation. There was an indication that I guess my question is, at what point does Via switch over from a point of sale situation where you're selling food and beverages to passengers to giving it out for free because you're in a difficult situation? How many hours in to a crisis like this does the food that's on board become available to all passengers regardless of their ability to pay?
Thank you, MP Strahl, for the question. There is a protocol in place. When we have delays, after a 45-minute delay, we basically open up our emergency snacks and water and provide that free. At that point in time, we stop regular service, provide the free. Another 45 minutes later, we go through another run-through, provide additional snacks and food for free, at which point, post that, we start assessing how long do we think the delay is going to be. Should we believe that it's going to be much more protracted, we would open up the carts that we have on board the trains. Next to that, should we have access to a station, we would find a way of getting to the station and getting the extra food that is actually in the station. Next to that, should it be even more protracted, we would order food and have it brought to the station or brought to the train. In cases of some of the trains, we were able to do that. In the case of Train 55, we were unable to do that. I understand that on Train 55, we were selling food that is against what we normally would have done. Once again, that's a failure on our part, and it caused anxiety to the passengers on board. So for that, I apologize.
Have passengers who had to buy food well into that delay, have they been refunded for those purchases?
At this point in time, I do not know the answer to that question. I don't believe we've been able to identify who that was. That is something we could take a look at.
Well, I would suggest that would be something that the review look at, because again, that was a bit shocking to read that passengers were forced to pay for food when they couldn't get off the train. I guess the next question would be regarding the washroom facilities. We heard that they obviously over a number of hours were perhaps at capacity. Is there anything in the regulations or anything that would allow employees in a situation like that to perhaps do what they never otherwise would do to ensure that passengers were able to have hygienic access to washrooms? Obviously, your tanks are full, you're stuck for an unexpected amount of time. That doesn't change the fact that customers on board still need access to clean, safe washroom facilities. So what provisions are there to ensure that is available, and do changes need to be made to protect passengers in situations like this in the future?
Thank you again for that question, MP Strahl. You're right. Given the protracted delay, there was issue in terms of the number of washrooms that were available on all the trains. In every case, there was at least 1 or 2 washrooms that were functioning at all times. To your point, is there something that the employees can do? In some cases, they actually did overrides, and they actually walk through and they have to do a manual reset on the washroom after it's been used. It's not a pretty thing to do, it's not a nice thing to do, but it's a necessity. And they actually managed to do that in order to keep at least 1 or 2 functioning washrooms. The difficulty for passengers is they were not in yellow cars. So on a larger consist, having 1 or 2 functional washrooms is not acceptable. In this particular case, that's what we were working with. We will be doing, this will be part of the fulsome review, and then based on any kind of benchmarking or any kind of recommendations we have, we will take a look at what we can do to improve.
Okay. Thank you very much. I guess my question, perhaps, I'm not sure who should take this, but obviously there are, going back to the emergency services, obviously there are everyone along the route, all the communities along the route, I imagine there is a relationship with those first responder groups, firefighters, police, ambulance, etc. Has that protocol been reviewed in light of, obviously there was a cascading effect here, weather, derailments on and impacts on both forward and backward of where the train was, but are you satisfied that the emergency plans that are in place are adequate, or has this exposed gaps perhaps even in that, should there have been a more severe incident? Are you satisfied that your emergency plans and your relationships with those providers are adequate at this time?
Thank you for your question, MP Strahl. Traditionally, those relationships were entirely managed between CN and their CN police force and local communities. Forgive me, I can't recall the date, but in my time at CN, a VIA police force was created and developed, and that force has developed relationships with forces along, first of all, VIA infrastructure, and then reaching out corridor infrastructure, and that outreach continues across the country, so that we have relationships and communications between emergency services and our organization.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brankley, and thank you, Mr. Strahl. Just to follow up on Mr. Strahl's question, Ms. Toporowski, if and when the passengers that had no other choice but to purchase the food are reimbursed, could you kindly confirm that with this committee, please?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I will.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first of all, let me say welcome to our VIA Rail reps with us today. Greatly appreciated.